During the 1930s, Hitler played on the hopes and fears of the Western democracies. Each time the Nazi dictator grabbed a new territory, he would declare an end to his demands. Peace seemed guaranteed until Hitler started expanding again. As we saw in the last lesson, Hitler had quickly built his empire, or Third Reich, in the 1930s by seizing neighboring territories. First was the Rhineland in March 1936, then Austria in March 1938, and finally Czechoslovakia in September 1938. In 1939, the Führer turned his eyes to Poland. On April 28, 1939, Hitler spoke before the Reichstag. He demanded that the Polish corridor, along with its port city of Danzig, be returned to Germany. After World War I, the Allies had cut out the Polish corridor from German territory to give Poland access to the sea. This time, Great Britain and France decided to resist this threat of aggression. As we saw in the last lesson, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin signed a 10-year non-aggression pact with Hitler on August 23rd. Stalin distrusted Britain and France and was not eager to join with the West. Also, Hitler was promising him territory. In the public part of the pact, Germany and the Soviet Union promised not to attack each other. Secretly, however, they agreed that they would divide Poland between them. They also secretly agreed that the USSR could take over Finland and the Baltic countries of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The Non-Aggression Pact removed the threat to Germany of a Soviet attack from the east. This was important because fighting on two fronts had been one of the key factors in Germany's defeat in World War I. Having guaranteed peace with Russia, Hitler quickly moved ahead with his plans to conquer Poland. His surprise attack took place at dawn on September 1, 1939. German warplanes invaded Polish airspace, raining bombs and terror on the Poles. At the same time, German tanks and troop trucks rumbled across the Polish border. The trucks carried more than 1.5 million soldiers into the assault. Upon reaching the Polish capital of Warsaw, German aircraft and artillery began a merciless bombing of the city. Warsaw crumbled under the brutal assault. As the Germans marched to victory in Poland, a stunned world looked on. Following through on their pledge to protect Polish independence, France and Great Britain declared war on Germany on September 3rd. But Poland fell to the Germans too quickly for those nations to make any military response. After his victory, Hitler annexed the western half of Poland. That region had a large German population. The German invasion of Poland was the first test of Germany's newest military strategy, the Blitzkrieg, from a German phrase meaning lightning war. It involved using fast-moving airplanes and tanks, followed by massive infantry forces, to take the enemy by surprise. The Blitzkrieg succeeded by swiftly crushing all opposition with overwhelming force. In the case of Poland, the strategy worked. On September 17th, after his secret agreement with Hitler, Stalin sent Soviet troops to occupy the eastern half of Poland. Stalin then began annexing the regions in the second part of the agreement. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia fell without a struggle, but Finland resisted. In November 1939, Stalin sent nearly 1 million Soviet troops into Finland. He thought that his soldiers would win a quick victory. So Stalin did not worry about the Finnish winter. This was a crucial mistake. The Finns were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fiercely defended their country. The Finns were skilled at moving through the rugged terrain of their country, while the Soviets struggled through deep snow and were crippled by frostbite. Despite their losses, the Soviet invaders finally won through sheer force of numbers. By March 1940, Stalin had forced the Finns to accept his surrender terms. For almost 7 months after the fall of Poland, there was a strange calm in the fighting in Europe. After their declaration of war, the French and British had mobilized their armies. They stationed their troops along the Maginot Line, a system of fortifications along France's border with Germany. There they waited for the Germans to attack. But nothing happened. Germany needed time to move soldiers and supplies into place, and did not want to launch an attack during the cold winter months. With little to do, The bored Allied soldiers stared eastward toward the enemy. Equally bored, German soldiers stared back from their Siegfried line a few miles away. Germans jokingly called it the Sitzkrieg, or Sitting War. Some newspapers referred to it simply as the Phony War. When spring arrived in 1940, the Phony War ended and the real war resumed. On April 9, 1940, Hitler launched a surprise invasion of Denmark and Norway. He planned to build bases along the Norwegian and Danish coasts to strike at Great Britain. And just 4 hours after the attack, Denmark fell. 2 months later, Norway surrendered as well. After conquering Denmark and Norway, Hitler began a sweep through Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. This was part of a strategy to strike at France. Keeping the Allies' attention on those countries, Hitler then sent an even larger force of tanks and troop trucks to slice through the Ardennes. This was a heavily wooded area in northeastern France and Luxembourg. By moving through the Ardennes, the Germans were able to squeeze between the Maginot Line. From there they moved across France and reached France's northern coast in 10 days. When the Germans reached the French coast, they swung north again and joined forces with German troops in Belgium. By May 26, 1940, the Germans had trapped the Allied forces around the northern French city of Lille. With a German victory inevitable, Belgium surrendered. Outnumbered, outgunned, and pounded from the air, the Allies escaped to the beaches of Dunkirk, a French port city on the English Channel. They were trapped with their backs to the sea. And one of the most heroic acts of the war, Great Britain set out to rescue the army. It sent a fleet of some 850 ships across the English Channel to Dunkirk. Along with Royal Navy ships, civilian craft including everything from luxury yachts to fishing boats joined the rescue effort. From May 26th to June 4th, this motley fleet sailed back and forth from Britain to Dunkirk, facing heavy fire from German planes and bombers. The boats carried an incredible 338,000 battle-weary soldiers to safety. The Miracle at Dunkirk, as it came to be called, saved the British Army from destruction and enabled Britain to stay in the war and continue to defy Hitler. Following Dunkirk, France seemed doomed to defeat. On June 10th, sensing a quick victory, Italy's Benito Mussolini joined forces with Hitler and declared war on both Great Britain and France. Italy then attacked France from the south. By June 14th, Paris had fallen to the Germans. Nazi troops marched triumphantly down the city's main boulevard. 2 days later, seeing defeat approaching, the French Parliament asked Marshal Henri Pétain, an aging hero from World War I, to become Prime Minister. On June 22, 1940, France surrendered. The Germans took control of the northern part of the country. They left the southern part to a puppet government headed by Pétain. The headquarters of this government was in the city of Vichy. After France fell, a French general named Charles de Gaulle fled to London. There he set up a government in exile committed to liberating France from German rule. De Gaulle organized the Free French military forces that battled the Nazis until France was liberated in 1944. With the fall of France, Great Britain stood alone against the Nazis. Neville Chamberlain, the advocate of appeasement, had been replaced as Prime Minister in 1940 by the energetic Winston Churchill. His powerful presence and skill as a speaker helped to inspire the British people. In one of his first speeches to the country, Churchill defiantly declared that his nation would never give in. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender." Hitler turned his mind to an invasion of Great Britain. His plan was named Operation Sea Lion. Its first goal was to knock out the Royal Air Force, or RAF. This would pave the way for Germany to land 250,000 soldiers on England's shores. In the summer of 1940, what became known as the Battle of Britain began when Germany's Air Force, called the Luftwaffe, started bombing Great Britain. The RAF was badly outnumbered, with only half as many planes as the Germans. but its pilots fought valiantly in defense of their country. At first, the Germans targeted British airfields and aircraft factories. Then, on September 7, 1940, they began focusing on the cities, especially London, in an effort to break British morale and convince the people to surrender. And what became known as the Blitz, bombs exploded daily in city streets. They killed civilians and set buildings ablaze. However, despite the destruction and loss of life, the British fought on. Two secret weapons helped turn the tide in the favor of the British. One was an electronic tracking system known as radar. Developed in the late 1930s, radar could tell the number, speed, and direction of incoming warplanes. The other was a German code-making machine named Enigma. A complete Enigma machine was smuggled to Great Britain in 1938. With Enigma in their possession, the British could decipher German secret messages. With the information gathered by these devices, RAF pilots could quickly get to their airplanes and inflict deadly harm on the enemy. To avoid the RAF, the Germans gave up attacking by daylight in October 1940 in favor of night bombing. At sunset, the wail of sirens filled the air as Londoners flocked to the subways. There they spent the night in air raid shelters. Some rode out the blasts at home in basements or in smaller air raid shelters. The Battle of Britain continued until May 10, 1941. Stunned by British resistance, Hitler decided to call off his attacks. Instead, he focused his attention on Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean. The Battle of Britain had ended, but the Allies had learned a crucial lesson. Hitler's advances could be blocked. The stubborn resistance of the British in the Battle of Britain caused a shift in Hitler's strategy in Europe. Although the resistance surprised Hitler, it did not defeat him. He would deal with Great Britain later. Instead, he turned his attention east to the Balkans and the Mediterranean area, and to the ultimate prize, the Soviet Union. Germany's first objective in the Mediterranean region was North Africa, mainly because of Hitler's partner Mussolini. Despite Italy's alliance with Germany, the country had remained neutral at the beginning of the war. With Hitler's conquest of France, however, Mussolini knew he had to take action. Otherwise, Italy would not share in Germany's victories. After declaring war on France and Great Britain, Italy became Germany's most important Axis ally. In September 1940, Mussolini ordered Italy's North African army to move east from Libya. His goal was to seize British-controlled Egypt. Egypt's Suez Canal was the key to reaching the oil fields of the Middle East. Within a week, Italian troops had pushed 60 miles inside Egypt, forcing British units back. Then the fighting ground to a halt. Finally, in December, the British decided to strike back. The result was a disaster for the Italians. By February 1941, the British had swept 500 miles across North Africa. They had taken 130,000 Italian prisoners. Hitler now had to step in to save his Axis partner. In February 1941, he sent General Erwin Rommel, later known as the Desert Fox, to Libya. His mission was to command a newly formed elite tank unit called the Afrika Korps. Determined to take control of Egypt and the Suez Canal, Rommel went on the offensive. Rommel attacked the British in March 1941. Caught by surprise, British forces retreated 500 miles west to Tobruk. The war in Africa went back and forth as each side struggled with the low supplies and the difficult desert conditions. In January 1942, after fierce fighting for Tobruk, the British drove Rommel back to where he had started. By June, the tide of battle turned yet again. Rommel regrouped, pushed the British back across the desert, and seized Tobruk. This was a shattering loss for the Allies. Rommel later wrote, "To every man of us, Tobruk was a symbol of British resistance, and we were now going to finish with it for good." While Rommel campaigned in North Africa, Hitler was active in the Balkans. As early as the summer of 1940, Hitler had begun planning to attack his ally, the USSR, by the following spring. The Balkan countries of southeastern Europe were key to Hitler's invasion plan. Hitler wanted to build bases in southeastern Europe for the attack on the Soviet Union. He also wanted to make sure that the British did not interfere. To prepare for his invasion, Hitler moved to expand his influence in the Balkans. In the face of overwhelming German strength, Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary cooperated by joining the Axis powers in early 1941. Yugoslavia and Greece, which had pro-British governments, resisted. On Sunday, April 6, 1941, Hitler invaded both countries. Yugoslavia fell in 11 days. Greece surrendered in 17. At Athens, the birthplace of democracy, the Nazis celebrated their victory by raising swastikas over the Acropolis. With the Balkans firmly in control, Hitler could move ahead with his plan to invade the Soviet Union. He called that plan Operation Barbarossa, after a great German emperor of the Middle Ages. Early on Sunday morning, June 22, 1941, the roar of German tanks and aircraft announced the beginning of the Blitzkrieg invasion. The Soviet Union was not prepared for this attack. With its 5 million men, the Red Army was the largest in the world, but it was neither well equipped nor well trained. The German invasion rolled on week after week until the Germans had pushed 500 miles inside the Soviet Union. As the Russians retreated, they burned and destroyed everything in the enemy's path. Russians had used the same strategy against Napoleon. Thousands and thousands of Russian troops were killed and captured as the seemingly unstoppable German war machine pushed deeper into the country. By September 8th, Germans had surrounded Leningrad and isolated the city from the rest of the world. If necessary, Hitler would starve the city's 2.5 million inhabitants. German bombs destroyed warehouses where food was stored. Desperately hungry, people began eating cattle and horses, as well as cats and dogs, and finally crows and rats. More than 1 million people died in Leningrad that terrible winter, yet the city refused to fall. Seeing that Leningrad would not surrender, Hitler looked to Moscow, the capital and heart of the Soviet Union. A Nazi drive on the capital began on October 2, 1941. By December, the Germans had advanced to the outskirts of Moscow. But Soviet General Georgy Zhukov counterattacked with 100 fresh divisions of tough troops from the eastern part of the Soviet Union. Even more importantly, the weather turned against the Germans. As temperatures fell, the Germans retreated. Their fuel and oil froze. Tanks, trucks, and weapons became useless. Ignoring Napoleon's winter defeat 130 years before, the Fuhrer sent his generals a stunning order: no retreat. German troops dug in about 125 miles west of the capital. They held the line against the Soviets until March 1943. Nonetheless, Moscow had been saved and had cost the Germans 500,000 lives. As disturbing as the events in Europe were to Americans, bitter memories of World War I convinced most people in the United States that their country should not get involved. Between 1935 and 1937, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts. These laws made it illegal to sell arms or lend money to nations at war. But President Roosevelt knew that if the Allies fell, the United States would be drawn into the war. In September 1939, he persuaded Congress to allow the Allies to buy American arms. According to this plan, they would pay cash and then carry the goods on their own ships. This became known as the cash and carry policy. Under the Lend-Lease Act, passed in March 1941, the President could lend or lease arms and other supplies to any country vital to the United States. As you can see by the chart on this slide, by the end of 1941, the U.S. had provided over $1 billion worth of aid to Britain and the Soviet Union. By the end of the war, this total would exceed $40 billion. This aid was ultimately critical in helping the Allies to win the war. By the summer of 1941, the U.S. Navy was escorting British ships carrying U.S. arms. In response, Hitler ordered his submarines to sink any cargo ships they met. Although the United States had not yet officially entered the war, Roosevelt and Churchill met secretly on a battleship off Newfoundland on August 9, 1941. The two leaders issued a joint declaration called the Atlantic Charter. It upheld free trade among nations and the right of people to choose their own government. The Charter later served as the basis for the Allies' peace plan at the end of World War II. On September 4th, a German U-boat fired on a U.S. destroyer in the Atlantic. Roosevelt ordered Navy commanders to respond. They were to shoot German submarines on sight. The United States was now involved in an undeclared naval war with Hitler. To almost everyone's surprise, however, the attack that actually drew the United States into the war did not come from Germany. It came from Japan.